I thought walking away from the church would set me free, but I ended up more lost than ever. I stopped praying. I stopped believing, but somehow God kept showing up even when I wasn't looking. This isn't a story about religion. It's a story about being broken and still being loved anyway. I sat in the back pew of the church one last time, not to pray, but to say goodbye. The candles flickered like they always had. The stained glass windows still spilled soft light onto the floor, but I couldn't feel anything. Not awe, not peace, just emptiness. I had grown up in this church, baptized here, confirmed here, even cried through my first confession here. But now every ritual felt hollow. Every prayer felt unanswered. So I walked away. I didn't announce it. I just stopped showing up. Sundays became errands and rest. I muted the voices that used to guide me. For a while, it felt like freedom. I told myself I was just evolving, thinking for myself. But somewhere beneath that independence was a quiet ache I didn't know how to name. A loneliness that didn't go away even in crowded rooms. A restlessness that kept me awake long after midnight. At first, I didn't miss God. I missed the habit of Him. I missed knowing what to do when life felt heavy. I missed the simple rhythm of kneeling, of lighting a candle for someone who was hurting, of whispering something into the silence and trusting it had somewhere to go. Without all of that, the silence just stayed silent. People asked me if something had happened. They assumed some trauma or betrayal had driven me out. But it wasn't that dramatic. It was a slow unraveling. Questions without answers, prayers that felt mechanical, and a growing suspicion that maybe I'd just been fooling myself all along. Maybe God wasn't real. Or if He was, maybe He had more important things to care about than me. Life kept moving. I got busy. I poured my energy into work, friends, travel, anything to avoid sitting still too long. Stillness made the questions louder. And yet, even as I avoided everything spiritual, little things kept showing up. A stranger's kindness when I least expected it. A verse on a billboard that spoke directly to what I was thinking. A memory of an old priest's gentle voice reminding me, God isn't gone just because you stopped talking. I'd brush it off. Coincidence, nostalgia, nothing more. But the signs didn't stop. They kept appearing in quiet ways, never demanding, just present, like someone was still listening even if I wasn't speaking. Then came a moment I couldn't ignore. It wasn't dramatic. Just a Tuesday night. I was alone in my apartment, scrolling through the noise of everything and feeling utterly numb. I suddenly thought, if God is real, I dare Him to show me. Not a whispered prayer, not reverent. More like a challenge, an accusation. Nothing happened, no light from heaven, no sudden tears, just stillness. But the next morning, something shifted. I opened my eyes and felt strangely aware. Not overwhelmed, but quietly awake. I noticed the sunlight, I noticed my breath, and for the first time in months, I felt thankful. That was it. Just a small thread of gratitude, fragile and unexpected. I didn't rush back to church. I didn't throw myself into theology books. I didn't suddenly have all the answers, but I began to say little things again, like, God, if you're there, or help me understand. I let my prayers be clumsy. I stopped trying to impress God. I just tried to be honest. Over time, the emptiness didn't disappear, but it became less frightening. I learned that spiritual dryness isn't proof that God is gone. It's often where He begins to do the deeper work. Like pruning a tree that looks lifeless, only for spring to come later with unexpected fruit. What surprised me most was this. I thought I had left God. I thought I had walked away and closed the door. But the more I looked back, the more I saw that He had never left me. Even in my silence. Even in my rebellion. Even when I mocked what I once believed. He was still there waiting, not judging. Patient. That realization undid me. Because I had always believed God would be there if I showed up right. If I prayed enough, lived holy enough, got my theology perfect. But now I understood something deeper. God's presence wasn't a reward for faithfulness. It was a promise, a covenant. A love that didn't flinch when I did. And so, I returned. Not out of guilt or fear, but because I missed being near love itself. I began attending Mass again. I didn't expect emotional fireworks, but I was surprised by the quiet joy I felt just standing among people who were seeking like me. Some wept, some knelt, some looked lost. We were all different, but we were all there, reaching. One Sunday during the Eucharist, I felt a weight lift. Not because all my questions were answered, but because I realized I didn't need all the answers to belong. Faith wasn't a test I had failed. It was a relationship I could begin again. I once thought leaving the church meant I had turned my back on God. But now I see it was the beginning of seeing him more clearly. Outside the stained glass, beyond the homilies, I saw him in the nurse who sat with my father during his final hours, in the stranger who paid for my coffee when I forgot my wallet. In the whisper of peace when I should have been panicking, I saw him everywhere, because he had been everywhere, even when I didn't believe. Coming back hasn't made life perfect. I still wrestle with doubt. I still have questions. But now, I'm not afraid of the wrestling. I see it as part of the faith itself. And I've come to trust that God is strong enough to hold my uncertainty. He doesn't demand blind belief. He invites honesty. He doesn't turn away when we're lost. He steps into the wilderness with us. This isn't a story about losing faith and finding it again. It's about discovering that faith was never something I had to grip tightly to be worthy of. It was always grace reaching for me. And maybe that's what I needed to learn most of all, that God doesn't love the polished version of me. He loves the wandering, wounded, skeptical soul who still dares to whisper, "Are you really there?" Because the answer, even in the silence, is still yes. I used to think that faith was a straight line. You believe, you follow, you obey, and life makes sense. But when I stepped away, I realized just how messy faith really is. It's full of detours, doubts, and moments where nothing feels sacred anymore. At first, I thought I was just going through a phase, a spiritual dry season. But the further I drifted, the harder it became to remember why I ever believed in the first place. I'd hear people talk about God like he was this constant companion, always speaking, always present. But for me, silence became the new normal. I would sit quietly some nights and just listen for something, anything, and all I'd hear was the hum of the refrigerator or the sound of cars outside. I wondered if I had been lied to. Or worse, if I had lied to myself for years, convincing my heart that it felt God when maybe it was just hope dressed up in religion. I didn't tell anyone what I was going through. I kept serving at times. I smiled when people asked me to pray. I knew how to say the right words, how to quote the right verses. But inside, I felt like I was living in someone else's story. There was a moment during one Mass, I remember it clearly, when the priest raised the host and said, "This is my body given up for you," and I felt absolutely nothing. No reverence, no conviction, just the heavy realization that I didn't know if I believed it anymore. It was terrifying, because once faith starts to unravel, it feels like everything else comes with it. Purpose, meaning, even love. If God isn't real, then what am I really hoping for? Who do I thank when the good comes, and who do I cry out to when the world breaks apart? Still, even in that spiritual fog, I couldn't fully let go. Something inside me, something I couldn't explain, kept searching. I would stumble across old hymns and feel a lump in my throat. I'd hear someone pray sincerely and feel strangely envious, like they were holding on to something I'd dropped but couldn't stop missing. And sometimes when I closed my eyes and let the noise fall away, I felt a faint warmth, not certainty, but a trace of something I used to know. Then one evening, a friend I hadn't seen in years called me out of the blue. We hadn't talked about God in a long time, but she asked if I was okay. She said she had been praying and my name came to mind. I wanted to brush it off, but her words cut deep, because I had been thinking, no one sees me, no one notices I've fallen away. But somehow, God had whispered my name to someone else, and that startled me. After that, I began noticing more moments like that, times when grace cracked through the routine. I'd walk past a church and hear the bells, and my heart would ache in a way I couldn't explain. I'd see someone make the sign of the cross before a meal and feel both convicted and comforted. These moments didn't feel like guilt. They felt like invitations, gentle reminders that God wasn't done with me. I started journaling again. Not polished reflections, just messy thoughts, honest questions. Things like, why don't I feel you anymore? Or am I even still yours? And somehow, in the act of writing, I began to feel less alone. Like even if God wasn't speaking loudly, he was still near enough to hear. One night I was scrolling through old photos and found one from my confirmation day. I was younger, smiling, holding a candle, surrounded by people who believed in me. I looked into my own eyes and remembered what I felt that day. Not certainty, but openness. A willingness to say yes, even without knowing what would come. And I realized something. Faith doesn't require having it all figured out. Sometimes, faith is just the decision to keep looking, to stay open, to show up. So I did. I walked into a small chapel one afternoon when no one else was around. The lights were dim, the silence thick. I sat in the last pew, the same way I had when I first left. But this time I whispered something. God, I don't know if you're here, but I'm here. That was it. No big revelation, no sudden rush of emotion, just a quiet exchange of presence. Me showing up. And I believed. So did he. I began to come back slowly. I didn't dive into theology or force myself into ministry. I just started sitting with God again. Sometimes in churches, sometimes in my car, sometimes lying on my bedroom floor. The point wasn't how or where. It was just that I was willing to stop running. And with time, the weight began to lift. Not all at once, but enough that I started to breathe deeper again. I began to notice beauty again. A child laughing. A song lyric that hit home. A moment of peace in the middle of chaos. All of it reminded me, God hadn't disappeared. I had just stopped noticing him. There's a story in Scripture where Jesus walks with two men on the road to Emmaus. They don't recognize him until he breaks bread with them. And I often think, how many times have I walked with God and not known it was him? How many times has he spoken through people, through moments, through silence, and I missed it? That thought doesn't shame me anymore. It comforts me. Because it means God doesn't wait for us to be perfect to reveal himself. He walks with us even in our confusion. He draws near even when we don't call his name. Looking back, I see that leaving the church wasn't the end of my story. It was part of it. It taught me things I never would have learned if I had stayed in autopilot. It showed me the fragility of belief and the resilience of grace. And most of all, it showed me that God's love isn't scared off by my questions. I still have days when I wrestle with doubt. I still get frustrated when prayers feel unanswered. But I also have days where I feel God so closely that I can't help but smile. Days when a line from Scripture jumps off the page and speaks directly to what I'm going through. Days when I see someone in pain, and instead of just feeling helpless, I silently pray and trust that it matters. This journey back has been slow, sacred, and deeply personal. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I have something better now. A relationship that's real, not always tidy, not always emotional, but steady. And in a world full of shifting ground, that steadiness is everything. I no longer believe that God only meets us when we're doing everything right. I believe he meets us in our mess, in our silence, in our wandering. I believe he walks with us even when we walk away. And I believe that no matter how far we go, we're never too far to be found again. There's something strange about coming home to a place that once felt like everything and now feels unfamiliar. When I walked back into the church I had left behind, I half expected it to reject me. But it didn't. No one stared, no one asked where I'd been, no one needed an explanation. There was just a silence that held me, a space that waited. And in that quiet I realized something. God had never stopped waiting either. Faith for me was no longer about lofty answers or perfect doctrine. It became about the little moments, those sacred seconds when I felt seen, when I felt remembered. I began lighting candles again, one at a time. One for my doubts, one for my family, one for the people I'd hurt. I didn't say long prayers, just simple words, "Here I am." And somehow that was enough. I had spent so much time believing I had to earn God's attention, that I had to perform a certain way to be worthy of his presence. But sitting there, among the flickering lights and quiet sighs of old pews, I felt the truth press against me gently. God never loved me because of my perfection. He loved me in spite of my brokenness. There's a kind of humility that grows in the soil of your own failures. When you've been shattered by your own choices, your own pride, your own silence, you no longer approach God with demands. You come with empty hands, and those are the hands he loves to fill. I remember the first time I went to confession. After years of silence, my heart was pounding. I felt like I had to explain myself, justify my leaving. But the priest didn't ask for a report. He didn't need the whole story. He just listened. And when he finally spoke, he said, "Welcome home." 2 words. That was it. But I cried in that confessional like a child who had been lost and didn't know how much they needed to be found. I carried a lot of shame, not just for walking away, but for the ways I judged others when I'd been so sure of my faith, for the spiritual arrogance I once wore like armor, for how quick I had been to see others as less faithful, not realizing that my own belief was still so shallow. Losing that false certainty was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Because when you lose the illusion of control, you can finally make room for grace. Grace isn't neat. It doesn't always come with an emotional rush or a holy glow. Sometimes grace looks like a quiet breath you didn't know you needed, or a text message from someone who says, "I was just thinking about you." Sometimes it's waking up and realizing the weight you carried yesterday feels lighter for no logical reason. Grace is subtle, but once you start seeing it, you can't stop. I remember one morning, I woke up before the sun. Not because I planned to pray, I just couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky change from deep blue to soft grey to gold. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel numb. I felt grateful. Not because everything in my life was fixed, but because I was awake enough to notice beauty again. And that felt holy. There was no voice in the clouds, no angelic vision, but something inside me softened. And I whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And I think sometimes that's what God waits for, not our loud declarations, but our honest surrender. That small moment was more powerful than 1,000 sermons, because it came from a place of truth, not performance. Coming back to faith didn't mean I had answers for all the things that still hurt. It didn't erase the pain I'd carried or explain why God had seemed silent when I needed him most. But it gave me something deeper than explanation. It gave me presence. The awareness that I wasn't alone, even in unanswered prayers. That God wasn't afraid of my anger or my questions. He could handle them. And more than that, he welcomed them. I started to approach the Eucharist differently, not as a reward for good behavior, but as a lifeline for a weary soul. I used to think I had to be worthy of it. Now I see that worthiness was never the point. It's about hunger. And I was hungry again, for peace, for love, for God. I knelt not because I had it all together, but because I didn't. And in that posture of surrender, I began to encounter Jesus, not as an idea, but as a person. Sometimes I would sit in adoration, still unsure of everything. But I stayed, I breathed, I let the silence stretch, and in that silence I felt a whisper inside. I'm still here. Not loud, not forceful, just steady. Like a father waiting for his child to look up again. And I did. Slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly. But I looked up. And when I did, I didn't see judgment. I saw mercy. I saw the arms of a savior who had carried me, even when I swore I didn't need him. Who had walked with me through nights of despair, even when I cursed his name. Who had never stopped calling me by name. There's a difference between religion as a routine and faith as a relationship. I used to think checking boxes made me holy. Now I see that love is the point. Loving God, yes, but also letting him love me, especially when I feel least lovable. I met others on this journey too, people who had left and returned, people who were still unsure but curious. Their stories didn't look like mine, but we shared something, a longing for something deeper than what the world could offer. And in that shared longing, I saw a glimpse of the church, not just as an institution, but as a home for wanderers. I don't claim to have reached some perfect state of belief. I still wrestle with doubts. I still get distracted. I still forget to pray. But now I come back faster. I don't stay gone as long. Because I've seen what life looks like without God. And I've seen what it looks like with him. And even on my worst days, I'd rather walk through the valley with him than dance on the mountaintop alone. What surprised me most was how much God used my time away. Not to punish me, but to prepare me. To strip away pride. To show me who I really am apart from performance. And to remind me that his love doesn't fade when mine does. I used to think I had to climb my way back. Now I know he meets me right where I am. Always has, always will. And in that truth, I've found a peace I can't explain. Maybe that's what grace really is. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of God in the middle of it. Not a clean, polished life, but a heart that keeps returning again and again, even when it doesn't understand everything. And that's the kind of faith I want to live now. Not perfect, not loud, but rooted in love. The kind that whispers, "You're not alone. You never were." There was a moment I'll never forget, a simple one. I was walking through the grocery store, pushing a cart with no sense of purpose, just grabbing things from the list. And then I heard a child, maybe 5 or 6, tugging at his mother's sleeve and asking, "Is Jesus here too?" She smiled and said, "Yes, honey, he's everywhere." I paused. That answer would have annoyed me years ago. It would have felt like an easy cliché. But now I stood there frozen, heart suddenly tender, and thought, maybe he is. That's what started happening more and more. Not grand revelations, but quiet collisions with grace in the middle of my ordinary life. Faith wasn't something I picked up once a week anymore. It became the thread woven through everything. In the way I spoke to strangers, in the way I listened when someone was grieving, in the way I forgave when it was hard, or stayed silent when my pride wanted to be loud. These weren't things I did out of obligation. They were responses to the love I had finally begun to believe was real, was mine, and had always been offered freely. I started reading the Gospels again, not like a scholar, but like someone searching for a voice they used to know by heart. And Jesus came alive in those pages, not as a distant figure, but as someone who had sat beside me on the floor when I didn't know how to get up. I saw him in how he spoke to the broken, the doubters, the ones who didn't belong. And I realized he wasn't ashamed of my mess. He walked toward it. The story of the prodigal son hit me differently now. I had heard it 100 times growing up, but this time I wasn't analyzing the details. I was inside the story. I was the one walking back barefoot, rehearsing my apology, sure I'd be met with conditions or disappointment. But instead, I saw the father running, undignified, joyful, interrupting my apology with celebration. That image burned into me. God wasn't waiting with a clipboard. He was running with open arms. I think I used to confuse conviction with shame. I thought feeling bad was how I knew I was growing. But now I understand. Conviction calls me back, but shame tries to keep me out. One leads to healing, the other leads to hiding. And God never called me to hide. Healing wasn't instant, it rarely is. But little by little, the cracks in me became places where light came through. I began to notice my anger fading, not because life got easier, but because I no longer carried it alone. I started asking for help, even in small things. And when I did, I found myself less afraid of weakness. Because now I knew that God's strength didn't require my perfection. It only asked for my permission. Some nights I still wrestle. Faith isn't always comfort. Sometimes it's a battle. But now I face the questions with God, not apart from Him. I've stopped expecting certainty. I've started choosing trust. I remember talking to a friend who had also drifted from faith. He said, "I miss it, but I don't know how to believe again." And I told him the truth. I didn't know either. But I started by being honest with God. I stopped pretending. I just said, "If you're still there, I want to know you again." That was the beginning. There's something sacred about small beginnings, a whispered prayer, a quiet return, a walk back to the altar even when you don't feel ready. These are not signs of weakness. They're signs of life. I stopped needing to feel God all the time. I started noticing Him instead. In the person who held the door open, in the song I didn't expect to hear, in the memory that came back at just the right moment. These weren't coincidences, they were invitations. And I started saying yes. Yes to Sunday Mass, even when it felt awkward. Yes to prayer, even when I didn't have the words. Yes to forgiving people I didn't think deserved it, because I had been forgiven first. Yes to letting go of the version of me that needed to be right all the time, and embracing the one who just wanted to be real. The more I said yes, the more I realized how often I had said no without knowing it. No to grace, no to peace, no to God, not because I didn't believe in Him, but because I didn't believe He could still want me. But He did. And He does. There's a freedom that comes when you finally let yourself be loved. Not because you earned it, not because you cleaned up enough, but because you finally stopped fighting it. I used to think freedom was walking away. Now I see it's coming home. And home doesn't mean life is suddenly perfect. There are still hard days, still silence, still grief. But now I have someone to bring it to. Now I pray not because I have answers, but because I trust the one who does. I've learned to love the church again, not as a flawless institution, but as a broken body that somehow still reflects Christ. I've seen beauty in community, in the old man who prays the rosary with tears in his eyes, in the young couple struggling with their kids in the pew but showing up anyway, in the priest who speaks with gentleness even when the world shouts. This is family. This is church. I used to walk in late and sit in the back, afraid someone would notice me. Now I walk in and find my place. I belong not because I've earned it, but because grace has made room. Faith for me isn't a feeling, it's a decision, a daily one. And some days I feel strong, some days I feel nothing. But every day I choose to return. I choose to believe that God's mercy is still deeper than my mistakes. If I could go back and speak to the version of me who walked away, I wouldn't try to scare them or shame them. I'd just whisper, "You're going to come back. And when you do, it'll be better than you ever imagined." Because God didn't abandon me when I left. He followed, He waited, He called. And when I finally turned around, He didn't say, "Where have you been?" He said, "Welcome back." There was something strange about peace when I first began to feel it again. It didn't arrive loudly. It didn't fix everything. It just settled in slowly, like the way sunlight creeps into a dark room through a cracked curtain. It didn't announce itself with fireworks. But one day I realized I hadn't felt that same hollow ache in weeks. The questions were still there, but they weren't sharp anymore. They had softened into wonder, and that, too, was grace. I remember lighting a candle in a quiet chapel. No one else was there. I didn't even say anything out loud. I just sat. I didn't feel dramatic emotion, no spiritual rush, but it was enough. It was more than enough. In that silence, I knew I was not alone. I had always assumed God only came in loud declarations and clear signs, but now I was learning He also comes in stillness, in long waits, in the hush of surrender. Old guilt tried to whisper again. It said I had to earn my way back, that I had to prove I was serious, that I was holy enough to be held. But grace had no checklist. Grace said, "You're already home. Stay a while." I had been so used to measuring myself against expectations, against past mistakes, against people I thought were closer to God than me. But that wasn't the way forward. That wasn't how God spoke. His love wasn't comparative. It was personal, intimate, present. There was one Sunday I'll never forget. A woman stood up to read from Scripture. Her voice trembled, and I could tell she didn't love public speaking. But when she read, "Nothing can separate us from the love of God," it felt as though heaven cracked open. That verse, buried in my memory for years, rushed to the surface and found new life. Nothing. Not doubt, not wandering, not shame, not even silence. I looked around and saw others hearing it too, each person holding their own reasons to believe or to struggle. And yet, here we were, together. That's when I began to see the church not as a museum for saints, but a hospital for the healing. Not as a place for those who had arrived, but for those who were still coming home. God had never been disappointed in my need. He had never expected perfection. I had put those expectations on myself. But now I was learning to receive mercy, to receive rest, to receive love, even when I felt unworthy. That posture of receiving changed everything. Relationships began to shift. I found myself listening better, apologizing more quickly, forgiving without needing an apology first. Not because I was trying to be a good person, but because I knew what it meant to be given a second chance, or a third, or 1,000th. I wasn't afraid of the dark corners anymore. I brought them into prayer. I named them. I asked God to sit with me in them, instead of waiting to be cleaned up before inviting Him in. And every time, without fail, He stayed. Sometimes I still struggled to pray. The words didn't always come. But I learned prayer isn't always about talking. It's also about presence. Sitting with God like you sit with someone you love. No need for constant words, just the comfort of knowing they're near. There were mornings when I opened the Bible and the words didn't make sense. But I kept showing up. I kept asking God to teach me how to hear again. And slowly, the voice I had thought I lost began to return. Not in thunder, but in clarity, in consistency, in peace. I used to think faith was a ladder I had to climb. Now I see it as a door I walk through every day. Sometimes I walk in boldly. Sometimes I crawl. But I enter, and that's enough. Because God meets me on the other side, not with judgment, but with joy. Healing began to look ordinary, making dinner, folding laundry, calling a friend just to check in. These became sacred acts because I was no longer trying to escape my life. I was learning to live it with God. One day while driving home, I heard a song I hadn't heard since childhood. It was simple, about God's love being constant, and I wept. Not out of sadness, but because something deep inside me knew it was true now. I didn't need a perfect explanation. I didn't need certainty. I just needed that song, that moment, that truth. I realized I had spent years trying to fill a spiritual void with distractions, performance, even busyness in the name of goodness. But all along, what I truly needed was rest. The kind of rest that comes from knowing you're safe, known and wanted. There's a joy now that doesn't demand to be noticed. It's steady, like a heartbeat. It's not flashy or loud, but it's faithful. And it shows up when I least expect it. In laughter, in stillness, in worship, in quiet reminders that God is not only real, but here. This isn't the end of my story. I'm still walking, still growing, still stumbling sometimes. But now I know I don't walk alone. I never did. I've stopped trying to return to who I was. I'm not that person anymore. And I'm grateful. God didn't bring me back to repeat the past. He brought me forward into something new, something deeper, something real. And if you're watching this, wondering if it's too late for you too, I'll tell you what I've come to believe with everything in me. It's never too late. Not for healing, not for home, not for God. Because while I walked away from Him, He never walked away from me. There are moments now when I walk outside and just breathe. The wind brushing through the trees, the sun peeking through the clouds, the sound of life continuing all around me. It all feels different. Not louder, not grander, just more alive, more sacred. Because now I know I'm not wandering alone. I'm walking with someone who never let go of me, even when I let go of Him. My prayers these days aren't long or complicated. Sometimes it's just thank you. Sometimes it's help me. And other times it's just silence, because I trust that God can hear even what I don't know how to say. I've made peace with not having all the answers. I used to think that faith meant having everything figured out. But now I know that faith is what carries you when you don't. Faith is what lets you rest, even in the tension. It's what lets you hope when things don't make sense, and it's what keeps your heart soft enough to still believe. Church feels different now too. It's not about showing up perfect, but about showing up real. It's about learning to love people with the same kind of grace God extended to me. I see the beauty in the brokenness now, in my own life and in the lives around me. We're all in need of mercy, and we're all invited to receive it. Sometimes I still feel the weight of my past. Sometimes doubt knocks again, but I don't panic like I used to, because I know where to bring that weight. I know who can carry it. I know where to find peace. The truth is, I left the church, but God never left me. And He's never left you either. No matter where you've been, no matter how long it's been, no matter how far you feel, you are not beyond His reach. His love has no expiration date. His arms are still open. Maybe you've been sitting with questions you're afraid to ask. Maybe you've been living with silence and wondering if God still speaks. Or maybe you've just been tired, spiritually exhausted, emotionally drained, longing for something real. I want you to hear this. There is still a place for you. You haven't missed your moment. God is still pursuing your heart. So wherever you are today, however your journey looks, I hope you'll take one step toward Him. Not a perfect step, just an honest one. Because that's all He asks. And if this story has touched something inside you, if you've felt seen or reminded or even just a little less alone, I want to invite you to keep walking with us. Subscribe to Holy Path Insights, where stories like this continue, where faith meets real life, and where you're always welcome, just as you are. Let's walk this road together, because the journey back isn't just possible, it's beautiful, and it's just beginning.